Chapter 34, Kingmakers. A long time ago, a great man once told me that there's a difference between honesty and integrity. He said honesty is telling the truth, but integrity is telling the whole truth. I've never forgotten that because the difference matters, especially when we're talking about leadership, about power, about culture, about the kind of harm that doesn't always scream but still leaves scars. And if we're going to talk about toxic workplaces, not just vent about them or whisper about them, but actually try to change them, then we have to be willing to tell the whole truth. Because anything less than that creates space for dysfunction to grow. It gives cover. It lets toxicity become part of the culture until people stop even recognizing it as toxic. Toxic managers exist because they're allowed to exist. No, the people above them may not have all the facts. But when they do know something, when there are patterns, complaints, turnover, fear, and they still choose not to act or choose to protect the status quo, that's not just turning a blind eye. It's keeping the lights off on purpose. Integrity isn't about what you know. It's about what you do when you know enough. From the Hyman Brand Studio, I'm JD Hyman, and this is the Hyman Podcast. This show lives at the intersection of the American political system, the weight of the human experience, and the conversations too many people are afraid to have. Equality, while promised, is rarely delivered. That's why we're here, to challenge systems, to tell the truth, and to hold space for the stories that demand to be heard. Some stories shake the world, others shake us awake. Every one of them deserves to be told. Once again, my name is JD, and this is the Hyman Podcast. Part 1. How they rise. We like to believe toxic leaders are rare, that they show up with warning labels, that there's some moment, some scene when they reveal themselves clearly. But most of the time, it doesn't happen like that. They don't walk in one day yelling at interns or flipping conference tables. It starts smaller. They cut someone off in a meeting. They take credit for someone else's idea. They give feedback that feels less like guidance and more like a veiled threat. And no one says anything. Maybe someone tries to raise a concern and gets labeled dramatic. Maybe HR calls it a personality clash. Maybe the person above them doesn't want to rock the boat, so nothing happens. And that silence, that collective shrug, is the beginning of power with no guardrails. They learn that they can be careless, that they can be cruel, that they can manipulate outcomes and people and narratives and still be called a high performer. They see that people will keep showing up, will keep doing the work, will keep their heads down, hoping not to be next. The behavior doesn't get corrected, it gets reinforced, rewarded with silence, with promotions, with more control. Because toxic leaders are not born, they're built. And most of the time, they're built in plain sight. I've seen it with my own eyes. I worked for someone who made decision after decision, not based on what was right, but on what wouldn't come back on her. It didn't matter if patients were uncomfortable. It didn't matter if staff were exhausted. What mattered was protecting herself. That summer, the air conditioning went out on our medical unit, and it stayed out. Not just for a few days, but we're talking weeks. Most of the summer, in fact. We had elderly post-op patients, medically fragile patients lying in beds, drenched in sweat, some of them struggling to breathe. And the staff, they are working long shifts in 100-degree hallways, doing everything they could to provide care in conditions that were closer to a sauna than a hospital unit. When the questions started coming in, what's the plan? Why isn't this fixed yet? I was one of the people asking. I was in the room. I asked her directly, how confident are you in that the repairs will hold? And with a straight face, she said, about 50%. 50%. That was the number she was willing to gamble on, for patients, for staff, for the integrity of the entire operation. And here's why. The repairs weren't part of a full system replacement. And if she moved forward with a partial fix and it didn't pass inspection, she looked bad to the auditors. So instead of fixing the problem, she waited. She sat on it, because protecting her image mattered more than protecting people. She didn't say it in those exact words, of course. She didn't have to. The math did it for her. She made a calculated decision to do nothing. And in the meantime, people suffered. Not because there was no solution, but because doing the right thing came with risk, and she wasn't willing to take it. But that wasn't the only time I saw her choose fear over leadership. Once, after a patient had died, we gathered in the conference room to debrief, to reflect. It wasn't an inquisition. We weren't assigning blame. We were trying to learn, to understand what just happened, to make sure it didn't happen again. Jean, who wasn't even scheduled to be there, showed up, on her birthday no less. She just wanted to help, to be supportive, to understand the situation so she could do her job to serve the team better. But Boston couldn't stand it. She had this constant fear, this low-grade paranoia that people were out to get her, that every question was a challenge, every clarification was a threat. And in that moment, she turned that fear on Jean. "If you don't shut up," she snapped, "I'm going to ask you to leave." The room went still, but Jean didn't flinch. She stood her ground and said calmly, "Is that what you want? Because I didn't have to come in here. I'm just trying to help." And I'll never forget that moment. I love that Jean wasn't afraid to go toe-to-toe with her, that she didn't let fear run the room, that in the face of someone who wielded power like a weapon, she chose to stay upright. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do in a broken system is remember who you are and refuse to fold. That's not leadership. That's cowardice wrapped in bureaucracy. And the worst part? She didn't pay any price for that decision. That's how it works. Toxic leaders don't rise because they're brilliant or visionary or uniquely persuasive. They rise because they learn they can make choices like that and no one will stop them. Because someone above them decides the risk of confronting them is too high. Because someone in HR decides the paperwork isn't worth it. Because someone else is more concerned with optics and ethics. And eventually the rest of us, we stopped asking questions. We stopped pushing back. We started to calculate what we're willing to let slide just to survive another week. That's how they rise, not with brilliance, not with vision, but with just enough protection, just enough deflection, and just enough silence to keep going. More on this after the break. Hi there. Support for the Hyman Podcast comes from listeners like you. Each episode is produced with the intent to tell the truth, elevate the human experience, and to create space for hard conversations that matter. If this work resonates with you, consider joining our listener support program. Contributions start at just $3 a month, and every little bit helps sustain this mission. To learn more, visit us on the web at www.jdhyman.com. We also welcome collaboration with brands and organizations who share these values and want to engage meaningfully with our audience. If that sounds like you, we'd love to connect. For now, let's get back to the episode. Part 2, the things we hid in the dark. I know the last time we talked, we ended on a hopeful note. We talked about what it means to walk away, to let the light in, to choose yourself when everything else around you is trying to hollow you out. But not everyone gets to walk away. And even when you do, the work isn't over. Because the culture you leave behind is still there, still harming people, still protecting the wrong thing, still pretending silence is professionalism, that complicity is diplomacy, and dysfunction is just part of the job. There's a cost to looking away, a cost to letting broken systems carry on because that's just the way it is. The problem isn't just the toxic leader, it's the ecosystem that nurtured their rise and refused to hold them accountable. That's how culture works. It doesn't shift because one person leaves. It stays entrenched unless someone takes a scalpel to it. And most people don't want the blood on their hands. We love to talk about accountability in mission statements and all hands emails. We say we value transparency. We say our doors are always open. We say retaliation will not be tolerated. But when it comes time to act, When there's real pressure, real discomfort, real reputational risk, how many of us can honestly say we show up with integrity and not just optics? It's easier to wait until the damage is done and call it a learning opportunity. It's easier to call it a personality conflict than to admit that you let abuse flourish. It's easier to reassign the problem than resolve it. But that's not integrity. That's evasion. And you don't get to call yourself a leader if you consistently choose what's easy over what's right. The real test of culture isn't what happens when everything's going well. It's what happens when something goes wrong, when someone raises a concern, when something isn't adding up, when a trusted team member finally says out loud what everyone else has been whispering for months. Do you act or do you spin it? Do you stand up or do you hide behind policy? Let's not pretend we don't know how toxic leaders rise. They rise because someone let them. They rise because they were good at managing up, because they brought numbers in, because their dysfunction got rebranded as urgency or decisiveness, because the people around them decided that their success mattered more than the wreckage they left behind. And when the complaints roll in, when the exit interviews start sounding a little too similar, there's always some convenient excuse. They just weren't a good fit. They didn't understand the culture. We're going through a lot of change right now. But here's what we don't say. We missed it. We ignored it. We were told and we looked away. No one ever wants to admit they chose silence. No one wants to be the one who stood by and watched the house burn down from the comfort of the executive wing. But somebody always does. And when the flames get too high, those same people will be the first to claim they had no idea, that they would have done something if only they'd known. No, they may not have known every detail, but they knew enough, and they still didn't act. That's not ignorance, that's intent. You don't need a smoking gun to take a stand. You don't need to wait for a lawsuit to say something isn't right. What you need is a spine, and too many people in positions of power have learned to survive without one. Let's be clear. No one's asking for perfection. What we're asking for is presence. For leadership that isn't afraid to look hard truths in the eye. For people who don't flinch when discomfort enters the room. For organizations that know how to tell the whole truth, not just the convenient version. Because that's what integrity is. Not just honesty, not just damage control. It's being willing to call a thing what it is, even when it reflects poorly on you. One of the things I learned in the aftermath of leaving was just how deep the rot had gone. How many people had stories, scars, and broken trust, and how little of it ever made its way to the people who had the power to stop it. But maybe that was the point. Maybe the silence wasn't accidental. It was curated, because accountability is dangerous in a place that's been running on dysfunction. That's what we mean when we say culture is complicit. You can train all the managers you want. You can send out annual surveys and throw a pizza party during Employee Appreciation Week. But if you do all that and still ignore the person whose behavior is draining the life out of your team, you've built nothing. Worse, you've built a lie. And here's the truth that makes people uncomfortable. Most toxic leaders don't get fired. They get promoted because they know how to play the game. And no one wants to admit they were fooled. The cost of playing politics with people's lives is the cost of silence, the cost of protecting the system instead of the people in it. And it never stays contained to one team or one leader or one department. Toxicity metastasizes. It spreads, seeps, lingers. It teaches everyone underneath that bad behavior is a prerequisite for advancement. And in time, it reshapes the entire identity of the organization. The damage doesn't end when the person leaves. It ends when the culture decides it's had enough. So the question we're all left with, the one we have to wrestle with, is this: what are we willing to tolerate? What are we willing to normalize? What are we willing to risk in the name of not rocking the boat? Because there is no neutral ground when it comes to toxic leadership. You're either challenging it or you're enabling it. And silence, however polite or professional, is never neutral. It is protective. The hard truth is this: the absence of accountability is not accidental. It's a decision. It always has been. For a long time, I lived under a cloud I didn't ask for. I didn't build it, I didn't deserve it, but it followed me anyway, clinging to my skin, soaking into my clothes, making the simplest parts of life feel like trying to breathe through a wet paper bag. And the thing about clouds is, after a while, you forget what it felt like to stand in the sun. I told myself it would pass, that if I kept my head down and didn't make waves, maybe the storm would get bored and move on. But it didn't. It stayed and it grew. And eventually, I realized that waiting for someone to fix it, waiting for the cavalry, was its own kind of surrender. So I stepped out. I spoke up. I let myself be seen. Not because I felt brave, but because pretending not to care was making me disappear. And something strange happened. The moment I stopped trying to survive in silence, I started to see clearly. I saw the cracks in the system. I saw how many people were quietly holding their breath. I saw how much power depends on us never realizing we have any. So I stayed. I kept showing up. I asked hard questions. I said the quiet things out loud. And even now, even with the bruises and the backlash, I don't regret it. Because when you lived long enough in the dark, you stop confusing comfort with safety. You start to understand what the light is actually for. It's not soft. It's not soothing. Not at first. Light is exposure. It reveals what we were never meant to see. The decisions made behind closed doors. The apologies that never came. The excuses that passed for policy. And for the people who built their authority in the shadows, who managed by fear, who hid behind titles and optics and plausible deniability, they're about to learn what happens when the light finally catches up to them. Like I said earlier, it's one thing to turn a blind eye. It's another thing entirely to keep the lights off on purpose. But even that won't save them. Some truths don't go quietly into the good night. Some truths burn. Some truths arrive with no warning, blinding, brutal, and long overdue. And that's exactly what's coming. Whether they're ready or not, here comes the harsh light of day. Here comes the sun. My name is JD Hyman. This is the Hyman Podcast. I'll see you next time. This episode of the Hyman Podcast was produced by the Hyman Brand Studio. I serve as the show's writer, director, and executive producer. Additional research and story development by Whitney Hall and Sherith Guest. Creative consulting by Monica Taylor Hunt. Visual branding by Kevin Aki with additional graphic design by Grant Furness. Our theme song Canary was produced and mixed by Jim Yosef with additional music licensed through Epidemic Sound. If today's episode moved you, challenged you, or made you think, share it, subscribe on your favorite platform, leave a review, and help us keep the conversation going. In loving memory of Mary Louise Layton, whose insight and spirit continue to shape this work. To learn more about the show, our mission and vision, or to inquire about sponsorships or guest appearances, visit us online at www.jdhyman.com.